G'day mate, 40 here. I was just scrolling through X this morning, which will be increasingly powerful as we move into the second Trump administration. And we saw how Elon Musk played a pivotal role in Donald Trump's electoral victory. And I was reminded on X that it was a day one priority for the Biden administration to allow boys to play in women's sports, to play in girls' sports, and presumably to be able to use the locker room. It was a day one priority for the Biden administration to allow boys into the girls' locker room. Hey, how insane is that? And Kamala Harris, on her X profile, she lists her pronouns. I bet there are going to be thousands of people removing their pronouns from their social media profiles as this backlash against woke becomes more and more evident. So there's a particularly stupid right-wing meme that's bouncing around, and that is, what happened to those 20 million extra Democratic voters? Right? Why didn't they turn out this time? Were they all just a mirage? Well, we haven't finished counting the vote yet. So by the time we finish counting the vote, those voters will be accounted for. Right? So anyone who is raising the question, what happened to those 20 million Democratic voters who just haven't shown up yet? Well, not very informed, not very thoughtful, and they're people that you can immediately dismiss. And so there's just this knee-jerk suspicion of fraud on the part of many ignorant people on the right. So who are the bright stars in the Democratic Party? Like, who will lead the Democratic Party to victory in 2028? Like, who will mount an articulate defense of the Democratic Party in the elite media right now? It's hard to think of anyone. It's not like the Democratic Party has this deep bench. The Republicans have a deep bench. They've got Ron DeSantis, they've got Tom Cotton, they've got J.D. Vance. Democrats don't appear to have a deep bench. So yeah, Democrat U.S. Senator Chris Coons go on, I think, Morning Joe, MSNBC, say the reason the Democrats lost is that the people were just too stupid to realize everything that the Democrats had done for them. If only the American people weren't so clueless. If only the American people were able to see how much the Democratic Party had done for them, that they would have voted Democrat, as though people's only concerns are economic and tangible. All right. Those Donald Trump trans ads were incredibly effective, and yet you hear elites just appalled that these ads were effective. But normal people don't want boys in girls' locker rooms. Normal people don't want boys competing as girls in girls' sports. And normal people are horrified by the idea that the taxpayer is going to be on the hook for some weird fetish for people to have sex change operations, and this is going to be taxpayer funded. And then that's going to precipitate a whole long string of expensive follow-up care. And Kamala Harris supported this. And the elite response is, oh, this only applied to a few people. It's not such a big deal. But we all have hero systems. We all have a sense of how the world should work. We all understand particular ways of what it means to be human, to be a man, to be a woman. And this day one priority of the Biden administration, we must allow boys to participate in girls' sports and allow boys to, access girls' locker rooms. And we must have the state pay for illegal aliens and criminals who want to change their sex. And you can never change your sex. All you can do is mutilate yourself. Right? Your sex is in your chromosomes. You can't change your sex. It's no wonder that these ads were effective, because it violates a normal person's understanding of what it means to be human, to be male and to be female. And when you violate that, that's just as much of a blow as getting punched in the face or kicked in the nuts. The notion that boys can now start playing in girls' sports and changing in girls' locker rooms, and your girl goes into a locker room and there's some man there wearing a dress, right? That is revolting to a substantial segment of this country, and it's painful to even contemplate this happening. And it's just dismissed as a real concern. But violation of your understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be male and female, your understanding of, say, the military is a heterosexual institution, or that marriage is a heterosexual institution, or that people should have the right to employ the people they want and not have the government interfere. People should have free association, right? And to just stomp all over these rights and say that we need more and more government interference in the private affairs of ordinary people. No wonder there's a revolt against that. And has The Atlantic ever published one pro-Trump article? It publishes hundreds of anti-Trump critiques, including after this devastating election loss. And I love it, because most of the critiques that I read are completely delusional. There are very sound, very empirical, very rational reasons to be concerned about a Donald Trump presidency. But these aren't usually the arguments made in The Atlantic. Instead, the arguments made are all about Donald Trump as a threat to democracy, and Donald Trump as a fascist. Donald Trump as a dictator. And the routine way that the news media talks seriously about how Donald Trump plans to become a dictator on day one. Right? This comes from when Donald Trump was asked in an interview if he plans to be a dictator, and he said only on day one. Right? It was a joke. But in Peter Baker's thumb-sucking analysis of the meaning of the election for the New York Times, and I've bought and read and enjoyed many of Peter Baker's books, but on Donald Trump, he's absolutely unhinged. And it's just routinely relayed in the elite news media that Donald Trump seriously plans to be a dictator on day one, even though Trump said it as a joke. And so Mark Halperin on the morning show said, why would the Trump administration give seats to the New York Times? The New York Times has not acted as a guardian of the public good. The New York Times has not tried to be fair and impartial and objective. Right? The New York Times was hysterically unhinged and delusional in its coverage of Donald Trump, and published very few critical articles about Kamala Harris. Would routinely distort, exaggerate, and manipulate things that Donald Trump had said, while play down the ridiculous things that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris said. So why would the Trump administration give out a press pass to journalists from the New York Times? Why allow them into press briefings? Right? The New York Times, in its political news coverage, is largely operated as a partisan weapon in the Democratic Party, and has continually, on an ongoing basis, like the rest of the mainstream media, shown no interest in being fair to Donald Trump, who is as deserving of criticism as anyone, but to willfully manipulate and exaggerate the things that he says to try to make a hysterical point that's completely disconnected from the context of what he was saying. Right, shows that These forms of the news media are not acting as guardians of the public interest, but they are partisan political operations from the left. And so why would they be given press passes to the White House? Why not give them to independent substackers and bloggers and podcasters who made an effort to be fair? Why would you reward people who have no interest in covering you fairly and objectively? And Sean Spicer, former White House press secretary under Donald Trump's first term, said that when he became the Trump press secretary, he had a meeting with the head of the White House Correspondents Group, and he was told, okay, this is the order in which we do things. So your first call on the correspondent from the Associated Press, and then you'll go down the row, and then you'll call on all the major networks, and then if you have time, you'll call on other people, and then when the Associated Press reporter says thank you, that means the end of the press conference. Like they were dictating to Sean Spicer, this is how things are done. And so Sean Spicer deliberately, in an early press conference, it flouted that. He called on someone from the back instead of the Associated Press and the networks at the front. When the Associated Press reporter said thank you, to signal that the press conference was over, Sean Spicer says, I'm going to keep going. So why treat people who are partisan political hacks as though they are attempting to be guardians of the public interest? Instead, people like Mark Halperin, who tries really hard to be fair, people who try to be fair should be rewarded with access, and people who are partisan hacks should not be rewarded. Okay, let's go to the chat. Dems are done with the fringes. Well, the Democratic coalition is still the coalition of the fringes. Do Europeans have co-ed showers? They can't grasp why Trump won. That's true. They're so smug about idiot Americans. And also now they're going to have to pay for more and more of their own defense instead of America being their security guarantor. Right? The United States has no national security interest in NATO. Right? It'd probably be very much in America's interest to get out of the millstone around America's neck of NATO. Let Europeans take care of themselves. Yeah, Fox News is quite low IQ, so I'll agree with that critique of Fox News. Yeah, it's amazing how arrogant and full of themselves these journalists are. Yeah, the contempt, the derision, the way that the elites in the news media just routinely talk down to us and say, oh, we voted for fascism, we voted for a dictator. And as long as they want to stay in their delusional bubble, they're not going to be very effective in the real world. So inevitably, the Democrats will coalesce and they will develop effective strategies at combating Trump. All right, they'll eventually get their act together. But who knows how long that will take. I'm not exactly sure who will be the people leading this charge and how effective they'll be. So we heard a lot from people like David Samuels, a journalist, writes for Tablet magazine. His wife, Alana Samuels, is the editor. Heard a lot from people like David Samuels that the real power behind the Biden administration, the puppet master, was always Barack Obama, which I always found hilarious because Barack Obama is quite lazy. there's no way that Barack Obama has the energy or the inclination to be pulling strings, and there's nothing in Barack Obama's schedule or what we know concretely about how he spends his time that indicates that he's been pulling the strings in the Biden administration. Instead, he's been making himself into a billionaire along with his wife and enjoying the good life. And so if there was this like great Joe Biden puppet master behind Joe Biden, Barack Obama, certainly didn't show up in the campaign. All right, where was the great puppet master Barack Obama during this campaign? Didn't show. So maybe there was no one figure behind the scenes who was like pulling all the strings. After all. Doggone it, I thought I had pages and pages of notes in my pocket, things that I wanted to talk about. Now they've all disappeared. Probably they've all fallen out. Oh man, all that work is gone. Gosh, I must remind myself to take photos of my notes. So we'll see if we have this major mental health crisis on the left. But so far in the real world, I've been struck by the lack of intense, violent reaction to the Donald Trump victory. How long can Donald Trump's opponents maintain their hysterical opposition levels? Like I suspect that the energy levels are just not going to be there for some people. Right, we don't see rioting in the streets. So this election is not nearly as surprising as 2016. Right, so then we were told the odds were 90% that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Right, this time, at least, we heard it was 50-50. So very few reports of rioting in reaction to Donald Trump's victory. And instead, there is considerable calm. And Rachel Maddow, right, who's always struck me as a patriotic American. She says that liberals and Democrats should get out there and reconnect with their Trump-voting friends and family instead of cutting people off because of their political views. Right, reestablish social ties with people who see the world differently from you. Right, that's a healthy attitude, rather than the contemptuous, disdainful attitude from much of the lead that you don't understand, all the great things that we've done for you, and you're just too stupid to notice what we've done. And not a lot of reckoning in the mainstream media about what a terrible candidate Kamala Harris was. She ran a great campaign considering her lack of ability, but she was incredibly inarticulate. And a lot of discussion about how the polls got it wrong and why did the polls get it wrong. But there's no informed discussion about the difference between private polls and public polls. The private polls got it right, and the private polls were getting it right for a year ahead of this election result. And the private polls were getting it right on the Democratic side and on the Republican side. You would think that if the news media wanted to inform people, they would tell them about the difference between private polls and public polls. Right? A private poll will cost 10 times, 20 times as much money, 50 times as much money as many of these public polls. They will use completely different methods. You would think that would be an incredibly important story for years that the news media should focus on. But I don't recall any article in the mainstream media explaining the difference between private polls, the polls funded and held by the campaigns, proprietary, right, incredibly expensive, detailed, and much more accurate than comparatively slipshod public polling. Right? That you would think that would be a major news story right now, to explain to people the difference between public polls and private polls, but Mark Halperin has been harping on this for years. I don't know why no other political journalist came close, to the best of my knowledge, to doing the type of work that Mark Halperin has done, where he is continually pointing out the difference between private polls and public polls, and that the private polls for the Democrats and the Republicans were saying the same thing, that Donald Trump had a small but enduring lead in the battleground states. And that even though Kamala Harris had a better debate performance than Donald Trump, there was no evidence that that was changing private polling. Another thing that doesn't get much attention in the news is that campaigns don't really matter much. Right? Kamala Harris's campaign spent $1 billion, and I would wonder if it even changed 1% of votes. So Kamala Harris had twice as much money as Donald Trump, right? And her campaign ends in debt. So campaigns often run themselves into debt thinking they're going to win, and then they'll be have to pay off their debt when they're in power and people want to cozy up to them. So Kamala had an unbelievable amount of money, and her campaign ends in debt. Remember how the Democrats had this great ground operation? And the Republicans were just using all these untested methods, outside groups, to run their ground operation. But political campaigns get a ton of attention. But where's the evidence that a political campaign changes many minds? People did not evolve to be gullible. It's good that Donald Trump ran a disciplined campaign in that at least he didn't cost himself the election. But this result was pretty much set in stone a year ago, when people were tired of the inflation at home, the wars abroad, and the war, or the desire to change the definition of what it means to be human, to be a man and to be a woman, was coming from the Biden administration. Right? Political campaigns have dominated the news, right, for the past year in America, and this is traditionally what happens. Campaigns dominate the news, but they don't change hardly any votes because people did not evolve to be gullible. And so what sucks up the oxygen in the news media is frequently of very little importance. Political campaigns don't matter much. Right? The facts on the ground were that if you didn't own a home and you didn't have a well-funded 401k plan, right, you were significantly worse off under Joe Biden. And so the Democrats won with people earning over $100,000, and Republicans won people earning under $100,000. So during the pandemic, if you were earning more than $75 an hour, you were just fine. You were usually able to work from home. But the Biden administration has been a disaster for people earning under $100,000 who don't own their own home, who don't have well-funded 401k plans. And those are facts on the ground, that all the fancy schmancy billion-dollar highly paid consultants, TV ads, not going to change. Oh, the analysis of this is going to be beautiful. Mark Halperin says there's a great book to be written on the relationship between Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff, how they got together. Right, there are a lot more scandals in that relationship and in Doug Emhoff's character which were deliberately ignored by the news media. So there's all this evidence of Doug Emhoff slapping his girlfriend, that he would hire female attorneys based on their looks, that he would create a highly sexually uncomfortable working environment in the law firm that he operated in LA, because he's just constantly hitting on his female employees. Right? All this evidence about Doug Emhoff's quote-unquote toxic masculinity, and the news media showed zero interest in pursuing any of it. Instead, they railed about disinformation and how Americans weren't interested in facts and news. But then they would deliberately ignore well-sourced stories of Doug Emhoff's bad behavior. Let's check the chat. I think this is going to be an exciting 4 years. Yeah, I'm excited about J.D. Vance as well. The Republicans have a really deep bench. Wonder how long until the establishment media like the New York Times and NBC become completely irrelevant because younger generations don't care at all what they have to say. Strings are being pulled from outside of us, but are they decisive? At least we've all been thoroughly unburdened by what has been. The liberals around me are very subdued and accepting. Just make some snarky remarks about flyover country, says Glib Medley. Yeah, the mood on the left is much more subdued than in 2016. How long could people keep up that level of hysteria? And now that Trump has won, it seems likely the popular vote, right? That removes a major Democratic Party talking point. Right? If Trump had just won the Electoral College and lost the popular vote, then Democrats right now would be focused on, how terrible the Electoral College is. So I detect no anger in the air right now. It's just quite a chill vibe. Remember how this election was going to split the country? We wouldn't know for days. Remember how we were lectured by our social betters, how we would not know the election results for days, and we're just supposed to accept that this is a respectable way of operating, that vote counting will have to go on for days and we have to be patient. Right? Florida had all its votes counted in a jiffy. There is a very good case to be made for a national standard and a professionalization of our voting system, like Australia has, so that we would get results right away, instead of allowing differences in voting tabulation by county, not just by city, right? Not just by state, but by county. Currently in the United States of America, right, the way votes are counted very differently by county, right? We have thousands of different ways of adding up and tabulating votes. Perhaps we need one professional standard for the entire country. Right? There's good arguments for that, and I recognize there are also good arguments for the current system. But it just seems ridiculous that we're still waiting on votes in California, right? We won't have all the votes counted in California probably for weeks. Seems pathetic. One stray comment I've heard in the last 48 hours is, how come roads are so much cleaner and nicer and more effective in red states with lower tax rates? You would think in high tax states like California, New York, right, that the roads would be great. The roads are falling apart here. Like, where the heck is all that tax money going to? Certainly not spent on keeping the roads up to date. So Mark Halperin is continuing his show twice a day right now. Excellent show with Sean Spicer, Dan Turrentine. I much preferred Dan to Tim, who was smarmy and slippery. Like very nice, Minnesota nice, but smarmy, slippery nice. And Dan Turrentine is much more willing to accept, things that are true, even if they're inconvenient for his side, while Tim would tend not to be willing to accept the blindingly obvious. So Mark Halperin came out with 12 points about the election. Says that Donald Trump is going to nominate for cabinet positions seasoned, highly accomplished people, which should reduce hysteria that the Trump team doesn't know what it's doing, that his priorities will be restricting illegal immigration, kicking out many illegal aliens, deregulating the economy, deregulating the energy sector so that we can have lower energy prices, which will bring down inflation, and selective use of tariffs, often more threat than reality, to accomplish better trade deals for America, to wind down the Ukraine war, and to do a lot less micromanaging of Israel. Won't have to micromanage Ukraine because Trump will be dedicated to just winding that war down. What a disaster it's been from day one. And zero sign right now of any meaningful introspection on the part of the mainstream media and our elites over the meaning of the Trump election and how they just consistently get it wrong. But you would think there'd have to be more Trump-supporting conservatives who get op-ed and pundit positions. So right now, in your typical network, in your typical elite newspaper, it's dominated by liberals, and then there are a handful of never-Trump Republicans. Right? There are almost no Trump-supporting pundits in the mainstream media. Right? There are no pro-Trump voices among any of the New York Times columnists. Right? Ross Douthat is the closest to that, and he's not a Trump supporter. On a typical CNN panel, it's three liberals versus a conservative. Scott Jennings made viral comments about Trump's appeal to the working class. So he's been a very effective pro-Trump voice at CNN. Heard from, Sean Spicer and a couple of other conservatives about how NBC News made a serious run at hiring a bunch of conservatives to try to lock down that commentary wing. But in the end, the conservatives didn't trust how they'd be used and deployed and how freely they'd be allowed to speak at NBC News, so they didn't go for it. But reality is going to kick in. And so even if it's just in pursuit of their audience and to keep their subscribers, right, they're going to have to open up the discussion to a wider variety of voices. So I sure hope Susie Wiles, who effectively ran Donald Trump's campaign, and the most important part of that was that she had Donald Trump's respect. So I sure hope Susie Wiles will be chief of staff for Donald Trump. It's certainly her job, you would expect, if she wants it. There aren't many people that Donald Trump respects. Vivek Ramaswamy, expect him to get a cabinet position. expect J.D. Vance to be much more influential in this Trump administration than Mike Pence was. So Mike Pence had a long history as a Reagan Republican. J.D. Vance, his political history is entirely as an American nationalist, as a America firster. So it makes sense if he has much more influence in the Trump administration. I believe that one of the top people in J.D. Vance's operation is an Orthodox Jew. I really enjoyed Donald Trump's victory speech. It was subdued, it was light, it was funny. He talked about sending JD into the lion's den and again and again and again to go and meet the press and other hostile media, and how JD Vance took up the task with enthusiasm and just hit it out of the park. I mean, in retrospect, what a great pick JD Vance was, and Tim Walz, Dancing Queen. Right? The more we saw of Tim Walz, the less impressive he was. The more we saw of JD Vance, the more impressive he was. Oh, this is the thing that gets me about elite pundit reaction to Donald Trump's victory. Right? They say, well, you have to admit that Donald Trump's victory was based on hate and division and resentment, that Donald Trump was feeding hatred, resentment, and out baser instincts, and Donald Trump's campaign was based on dehumanization of immigrants and feminists, and that dehumanization language is so bad. But we can't help but use dehumanizing language because it's just too exhausting for most of us most of the time to operate with the acknowledgement that even the people who experience life differently from us are fully human. So it's just that liberals express their dehumanizing language against their political opponents, while people on the right are more likely to express their dehumanizing language with regard to outgroups. Speaking of outgroups, I was using public transport the other day. This guy next to me is just spitting on the floor. So you're riding the bus, you're riding the subway, and a member of an outgroup sitting next to you is just spitting on the floor of your bus or your train. It tends to make it easy to dehumanize certain members of outgroups when they behave badly. It's a natural human condition, right? We can't help but regard, vast sectors of humanity as not fully human. It's just that people on the right tend to do it on the basis of race and religion and ethnicity. People on the left do it on the basis of education and political orientation. And the argument that Donald Trump ran on resentment and hatred is such a weak argument, because if you love something, you cannot help but hate that which threatens it. Right? If your wife is someone you love, you will hate those who are threatening her. Right? Imagine there's someone on your block threatening to rape your wife. Right? You would hate that person. That would be the natural, normal reaction. Okay, so imagine that your daughter at public school has to share bathrooms with boys who are claiming to be transgender. Right? You will hate the institutions that enable that. And then when you see leading politicians from the other party putting their pronouns in their bio, you will resent that and you'll hate it. Right? If you have one conception of what is heroic, what is moral, what is upstanding, what is worthy of emulation, and then you have behavior and rhetoric that completely opposes everything that you regard as holy and normal and healthy and heroic, you will resent that, you will hate that, you will despise that. You cannot love something without hating that which negates your love. So this focus of, Donald Trump's all about hatred and division and resentment, it's an inevitable reaction when you're opposing forces that besmirch everything that you regard as sacred, holy, healthy, normal, human, heroic. How else are people supposed to react when they encounter that which essentially urinates on their hero system, on everything they regard as holy and normal and decent? So it's such a lazy form of analysis, and it's dominant right now among liberal pundits, and not just pundits, the journalists. Donald Trump ran on rage and resentment. How else will human beings react when someone else is deliberately stepping on their toe, deliberately stepping on their hero system, deliberately denigrating everything that they hold to be normal, to try to obliterate basic differences between boys and girls, men and women, adults and humans and animal, right? Jews and non-Jews, citizens and non-citizens, straight and gay, right? To deny that different groups have different gifts, that men and women have different gifts, that boys and girls have different gifts, that Haitians and Ashkenazi Jews and the Japanese and the Chinese and indigenous Mexicans all have different groups, different gifts. Right? Once you acknowledge that reality, how would you not have rage and resentment and disgust with those who are trying to make an obliteration of everything that until now you may well have regarded as human and healthy and holy? All right, let's go to the chat. Oh yeah, I wonder why Putin is behind Trump this time. I live in Portland, Oregon, says Kendall. Man, I used to love Portland. That was such a beautiful, safe, healthy space. Downtown Portland. I loved walking around downtown Portland in 2001. Right, when words are said in the form of a joke, right, they have a different meaning when they're said seriously, or when something can be said half joking, right? When you speak satirically or provocatively or hyperbolically, right, those words can't be treated the same as when you're speaking literally. And yet the news media loves to conflate, hyperbole and comedy as though Trump is being deadly serious. And we've deported millions of people before, right? In Operation Wetback, President Eisenhower deported hundreds of thousands of largely illegal Mexican aliens who'd invaded the country. So I suspect that this new Trump administration will be much more effective than the previous one. Okay, talk to you blokes later. Bye-bye.